By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped from Dunkirk, leaving behind all its heavy equipment. Denmark, Norway, Belgium. The Netherlands, Poland, Czechoslovakia, all conquered. Nazi Germany controlled continental Europe from the Atlantic to Poland, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. The United States remained neutral. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany. Britain's situation appeared hopeless. Many in the British establishment, including some in the government, favored negotiating peace terms with Hitler. Former Prime Minister Chamberlain and Foreign Secretary Halifax explored the possibility, but Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, refused to consider surrender. He told the nation, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." The question was, could Britain actually resist? Hitler's Wehrmacht appeared unstoppable. And now Hitler turned his attention to Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But there was one absolute prerequisite. Germany needed air superiority over the English Channel and southern England, why air power was the decisive factor. For the first time in history, a nation's survival depended entirely on air power. This wasn't air power supporting ground operations, this was air power as the primary decisive weapon. The invasion equation, Germany had the army and the navy to potentially invade Britain, but crossing the channel with barges full of troops and equipment, while RAF bombers attacked them, would be suicidal. German naval vessels escorting the invasion fleet would be sitting ducks for RAF attacks. The invasion could only proceed if the Luftwaffe first, 1. Destroyed fighter command, so RAF fighters couldn't attack the invasion fleet. 2. Destroyed bomber command, so RAF bombers couldn't sink invasion barges. 3. Achieved air superiority, so German aircraft could protect the crossing. If the RAF failed, Britain would fall. It was that simple. The small British army, still recovering from Dunkirk, couldn't stop a successful German landing. The Royal Navy, though powerful, couldn't operate in waters dominated by German aircraft, as would be tragically proven later in the war. Conversely, if the RAF succeeded in maintaining air control, Britain could not be invaded. Germany had no way to cross the channel against determined air opposition. Everything, Britain's survival, the continuation of resistance to Nazi Germany, the future of democracy in Europe, depended on a few hundred young men in Spitfires and Hurricanes. The British advantages, preparation and innovation. Britain didn't face this existential threat unprepared. For years, military planners and visionaries had been building the world's first modern air defense system, the radar revolution. Robert Watson Watt had developed practical radar in the mid-1930s. By 1940, Britain had a chain of radar stations along its coasts, the chain home system. These tall masts could detect aircraft formations up to 100 miles away at medium to high altitudes, while the chain home low stations filled in low-level coverage. This was revolutionary. Previous air defense relied on sound detectors and visual observers. By the time you heard or saw enemy bombers, they were almost overhead. Radar gave precious minutes of warning. But radar alone wasn't enough. The information had to be processed and acted upon instantly. The doubting system, command and control. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding created an integrated command and control system of stunning sophistication for 1940. Information flowed from radar stations and observer corps posts to filter rooms where duplicate reports were eliminated. This filtered information went to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory and to group and sector operations rooms. In these operations rooms, WAFs, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, plotted raid positions on large maps using markers, updated continuously as information arrived. Controllers could see at a glance where every raid was, where every friendly squadron was, and make instant decisions about how to respond. This meant economy of force. Britain's outnumbered fighters didn't need to be on constant standing patrols. They could be scrambled when needed, guided to intercept points and used with maximum efficiency. The Germans were essentially fighting blind while Britain could see the battle unfold. Dowding understood defensive warfare in a way. Goering didn't. He knew he didn't need to win decisively. He just needed to not lose. He carefully husbanded his forces, rotated exhausted squadrons to quieter sectors, and never committed everything to one battle. He was cautious, methodical, and focused on sustainability rather than glory. Industrial mobilization. Lord Beaverbrook, appointed Minister of Aircraft Production in May 1940, drove a ruthless campaign to maximize fighter production. Bureaucracy was slashed. Aluminum was scrapped from everywhere, including the famous saucepans into Spitfires. Campaign, though its practical impact was limited, the propaganda value was immense. Importantly, Britain's aircraft factories were dispersed and hardened. Even when bombed, production continued. Repair organization was equally critical. Damaged aircraft could be returned to service in days rather than weeks. Britain also had short-term advantages. Modern fighters in the Hurricane and Spitfire, combat experience from France, and pilots who could bail out over friendly territory and return to fight the same day or next day. The German weaknesses: overconfidence and poor strategy. The Luftwaffe entered the battle supremely confident. They'd crushed every air force they'd faced. Göring boasted he would destroy the RAF in days. But the Luftwaffe had critical weaknesses. Strategic confusion. The Luftwaffe was designed for tactical support of ground operations, not strategic air campaigns. German doctrine emphasized close air support for the Wehrmacht. The idea of an independent air campaign to destroy an enemy air force before invasion was improvised. Göring constantly changed strategy. Attack the convoys, then the airfields, then the radar. No, wait, don't attack radar, he didn't understand its importance. Focus on the airfields again, now bomb London. The Luftwaffe never sustained pressure long enough in any one area to achieve decisive results. Intelligence was terrible. The Germans consistently underestimated RAF strength, thought they'd destroyed fighter command multiple times when it was still operational, and didn't understand the integrated defense system they were fighting. Technical limitations. The Bf-109's range problem was crippling. Germany's best fighter could only spend about 20-30 minutes over England before needing to return for fuel. Pilots had to constantly watch their fuel gauges. Many 109s ditched in the channel when they ran out of fuel heading home. This gave the RAF enormous tactical flexibility. They could break off combat and the Germans had to leave. German bombers were too lightly armed and armored for the opposition they faced. The Ju-87 Stuka, so effective in Poland and France, was a death trap against modern fighters, withdrawn from the battle after suffering catastrophic losses. The Bf-110, twin-engine fighter, proved vulnerable and often needed single-engine fighters to protect it, exactly opposite of its intended role as bomber escort. Göring's leadership failures. Hermann Göring was vain, disconnected from reality, and made catastrophic decisions. He blamed his pilots for failures, changed tactics impulsively, and didn't understand the nature of the battle he was fighting. When Bf-109 pilots asked for better equipment, he reportedly responded by questioning their courage. Most critically, in early September, when the RAF was genuinely close to breaking, Göring switched from attacking airfields to bombing London. This decision, driven more by politics and revenge than military logic, gave fighter command the breathing space it desperately needed. The crisis, late August to early September. Modern analysis suggests that by late August 1940, fighter command was approaching a critical breaking point, though not in the way commonly understood. Aircraft production was adequate. Factories were producing enough Hurricanes and Spitfires to replace losses. The pilot shortage was becoming critical. Fighter command was losing experienced pilots faster than replacement pilots could be trained. Casualties among experienced flight commanders and squadron leaders were particularly severe. These men with tactical expertise were irreplaceable. New pilots arriving at squadrons had woefully inadequate training, sometimes as little as 10 hours on Hurricanes or Spitfires, minimal gunnery training, and no combat experience. They were being killed in their first few missions before learning basic survival skills. Some squadrons had to be pulled from frontline service because they were too depleted and exhausted. The airfield attacks were devastating. Sector stations like Biggin Hill, Manston, Kenley, and North Weald were repeatedly bombed. Hangars were destroyed, communications cut, runways cratered. Some were operating from tents. The system was still functioning, but was being degraded day by day. Park and Dowding were rotating squadrons from number 11, group defending London and the southeast, to quieter sectors to rest and rebuild, bringing in fresh squadrons to replace them. But this couldn't continue indefinitely. Eventually, you run out of fresh squadrons. If the Luftwaffe had continued focusing on fighter command for another 2 weeks, maintaining pressure on the airfields and continuing to attrit pilots, Fighter command might have been unable to maintain effective resistance. The doubting system might have remained intact, but with too few experienced pilots and too many damaged airfields, it couldn't have functioned effectively. The Germans were closer to success than they knew. And then they stopped. The turning point, the switch to London. On August 24, 25, German bombers accidentally dropped bombs on London. They were lost and thought they were over their intended targets. Churchill immediately ordered retaliatory raids on Berlin. RAF bombers struck the German capital on the night of August 25, 26. Hitler was furious. Göring had promised that no enemy bombers would ever reach Berlin. The psychological blow was enormous. Hitler demanded revenge, terror for terror, bombs for bombs. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe launched massive raids on London's docks and East End. The Blitz had begun. Over 300 bombers escorted by 600 fighters attacked in the afternoon, followed by another 250 bombers that night. London burned. Civilian casualties were horrific, about 450 killed on that first day. But Fighter Command's airfields got a reprieve. Repair crews worked frantically. New pilots had time to train. Exhausted squadrons could rest. The system recovered. The Luftwaffe was now penetrating deep into Britain to bomb London, which meant German fighters had even less time over the target. RAF fighters had more time to intercept on the way in and out. The tactical situation favored the defense even more. September 15th, the climax. Sunday, September 15th, 1940, now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, saw the Luftwaffe's final attempt to destroy Fighter Command and open the way for invasion. The Germans launched two massive raids on London. The first wave came late morning, about 200 bombers with heavy fighter escort. The second came in the afternoon, another major formation. Every available RAF squadron was scrambled, number 11. Group, defending London, committed everything, number 12. Group to the north sent large formations to help. Even squadrons from number 10 group in the southwest were pulled in. Churchill was at the number 11 Group Operations Room at Uxbridge, with Air Vice Marshal Keith Park. He watched the plotting table fill with markers, showing German raids and British squadrons. Squadron after squadron shown as engaged, meaning airborne and in combat. Finally, Churchill asked Park, "What other reserves have we?" Park replied, "There are none." For a few minutes, every fighter squadron in the southeast was in the air fighting. If another German raid had come, there would have been nothing to meet it. But no further raid came. The battles were intense and confused. Spitfires and Hurricanes tore into bomber formations. German fighters engaged frantically. The battles were visible from the ground. Londoners watched aircraft swirling in combat overhead, seeing planes fall trailing smoke and flame. Claims versus reality. British pilots claimed about 185 German aircraft destroyed that day. The actual number was about 60 German aircraft lost. The RAF lost 26 fighters with 13 pilots killed. But the overclaiming didn't matter. The perception was what counted. The Luftwaffe had thrown everything at London and had been decisively engaged. German losses were significant, and crucially, they hadn't destroyed Fighter Command. 2 days later, on September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion would not happen in 1940. By October, as weather worsened and German losses continued, it was clear the Luftwaffe had failed. How air power saved Britain. The strategic impact. The Battle of Britain demonstrated several revolutionary truths about air power. 1. Air superiority was now essential for military operations. The battle proved that modern amphibious operations were impossible without air cover. This principle would be validated repeatedly. At Crete, where Germany suffered heavy naval losses, despite air superiority, at Taranto, Pearl Harbor, and eventually in the Allied invasions of Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. Armies and navies could no longer operate independently of air power. The RAF had saved Britain not by directly defeating the German army, but by denying Germany the ability to employ that army. 2. Technology and system integration mattered as much as courage. The RAF didn't win just because British pilots were brave, though they were. They won because Britain had invested in radar, command and control, industrial mobilization, and integrated defense. Military effectiveness in the modern age required technological sophistication and systematic organization, not just traditional martial virtues. 3. Defense could defeat. Offense and air warfare. Offensive air power doctrine, dominant in the 1930s, held that the bomber would always get through and that defensive fighters were obsolete. The Battle of Britain proved this wrong. Properly organized defensive fighter forces, with technological advantages like radar, could defeat offensive bombing campaigns. This had profound implications for the rest of the war. It meant Germany couldn't be bombed into submission without first achieving air superiority, and it suggested, though Bomber Command resisted this conclusion, that strategic bombing alone might not win wars. 4. Air power could be decisive without direct battle. Britain never invaded Germany during the Battle of Britain. The British Army barely engaged German forces. The Royal Navy fought no major fleet actions. Yet Britain remained in the war entirely because of the RAF's success. Air power had achieved strategic effects, preventing invasion, maintaining national sovereignty, enabling continuation of the war purely through air operations. This was unprecedented. The broader historical significance. If the RAF had lost, Britain would likely have been invaded and forced to surrender or negotiate. Peace by autumn 1940. Nazi Germany would have controlled all of Western Europe with no remaining enemies. The United States might never have entered the European War. The Holocaust would have proceeded unchecked with no Allied opposition. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, there would have been no Western Front, no British convoys to Murmansk, no Allied bombing campaign to divert German resources. The entire course of the 20th century would have been different. Because the RAF won, Britain remained the last bastion of resistance to Nazi Germany. Britain became the base for eventual liberation of Europe. American support could flow to Britain through Lend-Lease. RAF Bomber Command and later the USAF could strike Germany from British bases. The D-Day invasion could be launched from Britain in 1944. Democracy and freedom survived in Western Europe. The human story. Ultimately, Britain was saved by about 3,000 young men, the few, who climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes day after day, knowing that each mission might be their last. They were mostly in their early 20s. Many were still teenagers. They came from all social classes, aristocrats flying alongside factory workers and shop clerks. They came from across the empire and occupied Europe, Poles and Czechs fighting for their conquered homelands, Canadians and New Zealanders defending the mother country, even Americans defying their country's neutrality to fight fascism. They faced exhaustion, fear, and overwhelming odds. They watched friends die daily, sometimes multiple friends in a single mission. They flew multiple sorties per day during the peak of the battle. The psychological strain was immense. Some broke under the pressure, most kept flying. 37 Fighter Command aircrew were killed during the battle. Thousands more were wounded, yet they persevered, and they saved not just Britain, but Western civilization itself. They proved that courage, backed by technology, organization, and determination, could defeat tyranny. They showed that air power could be decisive in modern warfare. They bought time for Britain to survive, for America to join the war, and for the Allied coalition to eventually defeat Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain remains the supreme example of air power saving a nation, a time when everything hung on the skill and courage of fighter pilots and the sophistication of an integrated air defense system, when the fate of the world was decided in the skies over southern England. As Churchill said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few."